like to go back to my description of the process I used to analyze the Vietnam War and to evaluate its morality or immorality. In addition to the violations of the just war doctrine, which I have already mentioned, there was also the basic problem that the U.S. Congress never voted on a declaration of war, as was required by the U.S. Constitution. Rather, the Vietnam War went forward with a series of executive orders. It is true that the U.S. Congress in 1964 passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, authorizing further military action in Vietnam. But subsequently, it was shown that the U.S. military had provided misleading information to Congress to get the Tonkin Gulf Resolution passed. Thus, there was a violation of the just war criterion, which said that a war had to be decided by legitimate authority. Another fundamental violation of the just war doctrine was that there was no just cause. As I mentioned, the U.S. replaced the French imperialist forces in Vietnam, intervening in the internal affairs of that country. Just cause usually means self-defense, but the U.S. was not involved in its own self-defense in a small country halfway around the world. So these were some of the reasons why, according to the just war doctrine, I came to the conclusion that the Vietnam War was unjust and also felt that I had to resist it as strongly as possible as a Christian and as a U.S. citizen, because my government was acting in my name. So I had to oppose that as strongly as I could. But in addition to the just war doctrine, another motivating factor for me was the theory and practice of active, I would say militant nonviolence, as shown by Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and others. We remember that Rosa Parks in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to go to the back of the bus, which is where African Americans had to go according to law. She refused to do that. She was tired, and so she was arrested for remaining seated in the front of the bus. This launched the Montgomery bus boycott. We know that Gandhi, of course, had led a massive movement of nonviolence and civil disobedience for the liberation of India. And so these were very strong examples of what could be done through a very active, well-organized kind of nonviolence. So as I continued my study of the Bible in the seminary, it became very clear, it's quite obvious, that Jesus himself was a proponent and protagonist of active nonviolence. He was a great inspiration to Gandhi, as well as to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a Baptist pastor, and to Rosa Parks and to many others in the nonviolent movement. Here I would stress the active, militant aspect of nonviolence. We're now talking about pacifism, P-A-S-S-I-V-I-S-M. Pacifism, P-A-C-I-F-I-S-M, means making peace. It has nothing to do with being passive. And I'll just let you read this for yourselves, and I'll make some comments as we go along. So scholars point out that love your enemies does not mean conjuring up warm, fuzzy feelings for them or even liking them. This would be impossible. We cannot just create warm feelings of affection for our enemies. What it means is to love your enemies, and then as it goes on, by doing good to those who hate you. Love your enemies in the sense of wishing well for them, willing the good for them, and doing the good that we can for them. It has to do with doing, not so much with feeling. So do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. Praying for those who abuse you must mean praying that they have happiness and peace in life and that they stop abusing us. Now I'll let you continue reading here a bit, and then I'll offer some comments. What we see here is a very close connection between nonviolence and non-possession. Remember that Jesus taught both of these very challenging ideals, if you will. Jesus said that we must be free of our possessions and not attached to them. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. He said that in order to be his disciple, we must give up all our possessions. And he invited the rich man to sell all that he had and give the money to the poor, and then come and follow him. You might say, well, why is there this connection between nonviolence and non-possession? Well, in order to protect our goods, protect our possessions, or to get them back if they've been taken from us, we would probably have to use violence of some kind, force. And so in order to truly love our enemies, we are asked to be free of our possessions. Now, the first verse that you're seeing here, if anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also, and from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Now, if anyone strikes you on the cheek, scholars are saying that what that refers to, striking you on the cheek, is an insulting slap or tap, not exactly a jaw-breaking hit. That is, it's not the beginning of a slugfest. You're not going to become a punching bag. It's an insulting slap. And by turning the other cheek, we simply say that we don't take it as an insult. It doesn't mean anything to us. And we're still going to care for and try to do good to the person who has given that slap to us. So what happens here is that Jesus is asking us to really take the initiative here and to do good to our enemies, and with the purpose of softening the heart of the offender. This is meant as a strategy, if you will, to break the cycle of violence. Now here we can just read this. I think it's quite self-explanatory. And finally, we have this extremely challenging statement. It seems almost impossible. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. That is, taking a cue from the love of God for all of us, for sinners, for those who have offended God. God is merciful, and we are to be merciful also in order to be children of God. Jesus not only taught active nonviolence, especially in his great sermon, which is called the Sermon on the Mount according to Matthew and the Sermon on the Plain according to Luke, but he also gave many examples of his nonviolent attitude and practice. For instance, in the 8th chapter of the Gospel according to John, we find Jesus actually saving the life of a woman who had been accused of adultery and was about to be executed, about to receive capital punishment. And Jesus intervened and asked who would throw the first stone, and the elders went away, and Jesus said he did not condemn the woman. So he actually saved her life from a violent kind of execution. Remember, too, that when he and his disciples wanted to pass through a Samaritan town, they were denied hospitality. They were turned away. And his disciples wanted to call down fire from heaven in vengeance. Jesus said, absolutely not. And they just went on. The Good Samaritan parable in Luke chapter 10 is really all about the question, who is my neighbor? That is what Jesus is replying to, the question he's responding to when he gave this parable. So we see that the Samaritan, who was an enemy of the Jewish person, probably a Jewish person who had been beaten up and was left to die at the side of the road, the Samaritan comes along and who is considered an enemy. They're both considered enemies of one another. But the Good Samaritan had the compassion and the courage to actually reach out to the Jewish person on the street. And so it's really an example of overcoming the barriers that separate groups of people and keep us hostile towards one another. Remember, too, that at the time of his arrest, Jesus told Peter to put away his sword. Jesus did not want to be defended by violence. He forgave people from the cross, not only the thief who asked for Jesus' mercy, but he forgave his executioners, saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And before that, shortly before that, according to the synoptics, Jesus had thrown the money changers and merchants out of the temple. Very active, very dramatic, militant kind of nonviolence. So this active, prophetic nonviolence of Jesus, both as he taught it and as he practiced it, have been great inspirations and motivation to me in helping me to get involved in nonviolent activity. Other people who motivated me, I mentioned earlier, Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and others. But with regard to my involvement in the movement against the draft, the movement against the war in Vietnam in 1969, I want to mention especially Phil Berrigan and Dan Berrigan. Phil Berrigan and 3 other people took part in an action in Baltimore in 1967. They were called the Baltimore Four. They destroyed draft records as an act of nonviolent resistance against the draft and the war. A year later, in 1968, Phil Berrigan and his brother Dan Berrigan, a Jesuit, and 7 others participated in a similar action of burning draft files at Catonsville, Maryland. And both Dan and Phil had a great influence on me. I got to know them, and I heard talks from them, and I was invited to some meetings with them and retreats, and all of that helped me to form my conscience and to decide to get involved in draft resistance as well. Now, since the action in 1969 and after I got out of federal prison in 1972, I have participated in a few actions of nonviolent civil disobedience. In 1989, as a response to the massacre of the 6 Jesuits and the 2 women at the Jesuit University, the Central American University in San Salvador, a number of us demonstrated outside the White House, and 2 of us, Phil Berrigan and myself, poured blood on the gatepost of the White House as a protest against U.S. involvement in El Salvador, because after all, it was the U.S. who had trained and supplied the Salvadoran troops who had carried out this massacre against the Jesuits and the 2 women at our university. So we participated in that action of civil disobedience, pouring blood on the front gatepost of the White House, and Phil and I were arrested for that, spent the night in jail, and about 29 other people were arrested for a kind of sit-in or die-in in front of the White House. In 1997, I participated along with some other people in a sit-in at the U.S. Embassy in Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras. We were protesting the disappearance of Father Jim Guadalupe Carney, who had disappeared in Honduras in 1983, and we knew that the U.S. State Department and CIA and probably U.S. Special Forces had information about the disappearance of Father Carney, but they were not releasing it. In fact, the pages they released under the Freedom of Information Act were about 50% blacked out. So we were demanding to get that information to find out exactly what happened to Father Carney and the others and where their remains were. Father Carney had participated as a chaplain with an armed revolutionary group that went into Honduras from Nicaragua in 1983, and most of the people disappeared. So we did a sit-in the front door of the U.S. Embassy in Honduras. Pat Carney, Father Guadalupe Carney's brother, and several of others of us were involved. We stopped the people from going in and out of the embassy, at least through that door, during the day. And then at night, we were carried out very gently, I might say, by the U.S. Marines and deposited on the sidewalk just outside the embassy. And then in the year 2003, I participated in an action with the School of the Americas Watch. We simply crossed the line at Fort Benning, where the School of the Americas, now known as the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, was located and still is located. We walked across the line and were arrested by military police. This was a protest, and it has continued over many years, a protest of the School of the Americas training the troops and officers of Latin American armies, many of whom have gone on to become some of the most infamous torturers and repressors in that part of the world. So for that, I was sentenced to 3 months in jail, which I served in the Muskogee County Jail. I might also mention that fasting as a nonviolent action has also been something that I've participated in. In 1997, after our sit-in at the U.S. Embassy in Honduras, two of us stayed in Honduras for about 45 days demonstrating, organizing demonstrations with many people involved, many Hondurans involved, in front of the U.S. Embassy. And during that period, we were on a liquids-only fast for about 45 days. Similarly, in 2004, actually, when I was in the Muskogee County Jail in Georgia after the School of the Americas action, which we had done in November of 2003, we were in jail in 2004. I also fasted for 45 days during that time, just on liquids. Now, over the years, I would say both the just war doctrine and the theory and practice of active nonviolence have been part of my thinking about war and have motivated me and helped me to get involved in the peace movement. I have never been able to completely reject the just war theory, even though I recognize that it has been used by church leaders of various churches on both sides of the battlefields to justify their government's participation in the same war. So it has been very ineffective, and yet I think the principles are still valid. We need to remember in relation to the just war doctrine that Archbishop Oscar Romero used part of the just war theory when he told the Salvadoran troops that they should not obey an unjust order, for instance, to massacre civilians. And Archbishop Oscar Romero of the Archdiocese of San Salvador was assassinated the next day. But he had used that principle, that is, of civilian immunity, that principle of the just war doctrine, as part of his sermon. Now, during the first few centuries of the church, the predominant official teaching was that of nonviolence. But with the legal recognition of the church in the 4th century, and then when it soon became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the just war theory began to predominate in church teachings about war, continuing to the present. There is now a very significant breakthrough for active nonviolence in official church doctrine on war and on other uses of violence. Pope Francis has responded to important input, which he had asked for, from persons and groups committed to active nonviolence, and the Pope signed on December 8th, 2016, this message.
Let us make active nonviolence our way of life. On this occasion, I would like to reflect on nonviolence as a style of politics for peace. I ask God to help all of us to cultivate nonviolence in our most personal thoughts and values. May charity and nonviolence govern how we treat each other as individuals, within society, and in international life. When victims of violence are able to resist the temptation to retaliate, they become the most credible promoters of nonviolent peacemaking. In the most local and ordinary situations, and in the international order, may nonviolence become the hallmark of our decisions, our relationships, and our actions, and indeed of political life in all its forms. Violence is not the cure for our broken world. Countering violence with violence leads at best to forced migrations and enormous suffering, because vast amounts of resources are diverted to military ends and away from the everyday needs of young people, families experiencing hardship, the elderly, the infirm, and the great majority of people in our world.
I would like to insert a little footnote here to remind us that the Vatican has quite a long tradition of teaching on this aspect of the immorality of the arms race. That is, that it kills the poor by causing them to starve. Years later, Bishop Thomas Gumbleton, Auxiliary Bishop of Detroit, commented on the 1976 statement, quote, "When you spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year for weapons, as the U.S. does, you're robbing the poor, causing them to starve. It's an act of aggression."
The good news. Jesus himself lived in violent times, yet he taught that the true battlefield, where violence and peace meet, is the human heart. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. Mark 7:21. But Christ's message in this regard offers a radically positive approach. He unfailingly preached God's unconditional love, which welcomes and forgives. He taught his disciples to love their enemies, Matthew 5:44, and to turn the other cheek, Matthew 5:39. When he stopped her accusers from stoning the woman caught in adultery, John 8:1-11, and when on the night before he died he told Peter to put away his sword, Matthew 26:52, Jesus marked out the path of nonviolence. He walked that path to the very end, to the cross, whereby he became our peace and put an end to hostility. Ephesians 2:14-16. Whoever accepts the good news of Jesus is able to acknowledge the violence within and be healed by God's mercy, becoming in turn an instrument of reconciliation. To be true followers of Jesus today also includes embracing his teaching about nonviolence. The gospel command to love your enemies, Luke 6:27, is rightly considered the Magna Carta of Christian nonviolence. It does not consist in succumbing to evil, but in responding to evil with good, Romans 12:17-21, and thereby breaking the chain of injustice. Benedict XVI, 18th February 2007. More powerful than violence. Nonviolence is sometimes taken to mean surrender, lack of involvement, and passivity, but this is not the case. The decisive and consistent practice of nonviolence has produced impressive results. The achievements of Mahatma Gandhi and Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan in the liberation of India, and of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in combating racial discrimination, will never be forgotten. Women, in particular, are often leaders of nonviolence, as, for example, was Lima Boy and thousands of Liberian women who organized pray-ins and nonviolent protest that resulted in high-level peace talks to end the Second Civil War in Liberia. I plead for disarmament and for the prohibition and abolition of nuclear weapons. Nuclear deterrence and the threat of mutual assured destruction are incapable of grounding such an ethics. I plead with equal urgency for an end to domestic violence and to the abuse of women and children. My invitation: peace building through active nonviolence is the natural and necessary complement to the Church's continuing efforts to limit the use of force by the application of moral norms. She does so by her participation in the work of international institutions and through the competent contribution made by so many Christians to the drafting of legislation at all levels.
What the Pope is saying here is that active nonviolence necessarily complements the just war theory in the Church's teaching on war and peace. Thus, he is not completely rejecting the just war theory, but he is saying that what we must proclaim and emphasize is nonviolence. This is to be our contribution to world peace and justice. And this is certainly in keeping with Jesus' own emphasis on active nonviolence throughout the Gospels. This is what he proclaimed by word and action. He did not teach any just war theory.
Jesus himself offers a manual for this strategy of peacemaking in the Sermon on the Mount. The 8 Beatitudes, Matthew 5:3-10, provide a portrait of the person we could describe as blessed, good, and authentic. Blessed are the meek, Jesus tells us, the merciful, and the peacemakers, those who are pure in heart, and those who hunger and thirst for justice. I pledge the assistance of the Church in every effort to build peace through active and creative nonviolence.
In this regard, his September 2015 visit and speech to the U.S. Congress is very significant. He spoke of 4 great Americans: Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton. The last 3 were prominent contemporary advocates of active nonviolence. The Pope's other significant visit took place 2 months before his speech to the U.S. Congress. In July 2015, he visited Ecuador, Bolivia, and Paraguay. On July 9th, he spoke to community activists in Bolivia, urging them to organize and struggle for real social, political, and economic change. This is significant in relation to his January 2017 message on active nonviolence, since it shows the Pope's passion for justice and his advocacy of organizing. For him, active nonviolence is a means of struggling for social transformation. There is nothing passive or defeatist about it. Let us take a brief look at the contents of Francis' speech to community activists in Bolivia in 2015.
This is very, very interesting stuff because he's talking to a big meeting, community activists, community organizers, and he really fed them a lot of good stuff to really turn them on and encourage them and support them. So this was in Bolivia. He called it an intolerable global economic system that we're in. And the future is fundamentally in the hands of peoples and in their ability to organize. He's not naive about the process of social change. You need to organize. We shouldn't be discouraged. We do little things, local situations, but you actively resist. Now this is strong language. Actively resist. And this Pope is more into turning people on to organizing, I think, than previous ones. So here he talks about the mentality of profit at any price with no concern for social exclusion or the destruction of nature. Here he's putting those two things together, which I mentioned before, the social exclusion or indifference towards the poor, indifference towards many groups, that's exclusion, or exploitation of them. It's the same kind of lack of love, the same kind of opposite of love for your neighbor, but also the destruction of nature. The two go together, and the mentality of profit at any price is the cause of both. Now here he's really trying to give us hope, give people, the exploited, the lowly, the poor, the underprivileged. He seems to believe that it's the people, the powerless, people who are relatively powerless, who are the ones who need to get together and change the system. People in power are not going to do it, but people out of power can do a lot by coming together and organizing. Through your ability to organize and carry out creative alternatives. This is really a very simple, clear statement of why should Christians get involved in politics. This is basically what it's all about. If we love one another, you love your neighbor, love one another as Jesus loved us, this is how they will know that you are Christians, by your love for one another. Well, that means that fraternal love will move us to carry out our work in opposing social injustice. If you love people, then when we see people suffering, or we ourselves are suffering under these systems, then we need to organize to struggle against social injustice for the benefit of all.